to allow as many people to join as possible. And a huge welcome to Vanessa and Alistair, who'll be our expert panel today, very much on geopolitics and the big themes happening in the world around, US, China, Biden, but very specifically and practically thinking through, what does that mean for corporate affairs, thinking about, those of us who, lead organisations and lead teams in Brisbane, how should we be thinking about this, and how can we as corporate affairs professionals really align our organisations behind what those demands mean. So I won't repeat the bios that we sent out, but Vanessa and Alistair bring, some really unique experience around navigating some of these issues in multiple markets. So really looking forward to hearing from them. We will be recording the session, and for those of who had last minute conflicts and who couldn't join us, we'll send out a link as usual after the event. And as always, this is meant to be a very informal community of practice, an opportunity for senior professionals and practitioners based in Brisbane to ask the questions, learn from each other, share knowledge, share expertise. So at any point, if you wanted to come off mute and ask your question, if you wanted to type your question in the chat box, and I'd be happy to moderate those accordingly. But really meant to be an informal discussion. Obviously, we're all here in a personal capacity. We're not here representing our organisation. But yeah, really looking forward to hopefully a lively and informal discussion today about this topic. Without further ado, I, as usual, will kick off with a few questions to Alistair and Vanessa. But again, start thinking about your questions. Anytime you want to jump in, please do so. And before I begin, just a huge thank you again to Erica and the team at UNU for partnering and supporting us to do these events. Which would not happen without that. So thank you. So. Obviously, a big year in 2020, but it looks like 2021 isn't going to be any different. Alistair and Vanessa, maybe to kick off, do you think geopolitical risk is something that we should just have more on our minds as we head into 2021? In your experience, working with organisations and working with your clients, is it something that's top of mind for CEOs at the moment, and should it be?
Okay. Vanessa, did you want to kick off on this?
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's probably not top of mind enough, and needs to be much more. Now, I think at one end of town, at the very big end, if you're talking about the big mining companies, for example, the oil and gas companies, energy, those sorts of companies, it is very much top of mind. They're global companies. They're used to dealing with political risk. If you're operating in Papua New Guinea, or you're operating in Africa or Central or South America, you're used to things happening and having to prepare for them and think about them a lot. But the real issue starts to happen now when it can affect small and medium enterprises. If you think about the Australia-China relationship and the dynamic that's been evolving over the last few years, and particularly during 2020. And we've seen a lot of smaller companies, medium-sized companies hit by tariffs on barley, tariffs on wine, etc., because of difficulties in that relationship. These are things that they, could have been thinking about, because they didn't just come out of the blue. This has been building up for a good 5 or 6 years. If you think about barley, China had that on the table 5 years ago, that they were looking at barley and thought that there was dumping occurring, which meant they could possibly take action at any time. And so there is a real need to keep an eye on what's happening geopolitically and be putting in place planning around it. What are the scenarios that could play out? How do you deal with those? Vanessa?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think, what 2020 taught us was to expect the unexpected, and whilst and this year is just looking quite similar with COVID still surging in parts of the globe, and a very uneven vaccination program rolling out, and the interwoven complexities of that geopolitically, I think you know, can somewhat feel removed, I guess, sometimes, you know, for local business in Australia, but we really need to, you know, have that on our risk radars and planning and look at how it can affect us, you know, in a local market. I mean, the change that I saw in Hong Kong, you know, in less than 2 years was almost unbelievable, you know, in terms of the operating environment. So, you know, I think we have to be eyes wide open and really, you know, preparing for, you know, for that risk and knowing that, you know, even though it feels like it's not touching our markets or it's not touching our regions, you know, things change really quickly at the moment.
Yeah.
Could I just add something there? One of the most surprising things for me in 2020 was how surprised everyone was by a global pandemic. We've been warned about this, I think, since about the 1960s that there was one happening. I was in China when SARS happened, and everyone was then worried that that could become a pandemic, and what do we do about it? And they got it under control quickly. And somehow the world had become pretty relaxed about the risk of a pandemic, but that risk was always there. Both corporations and governments were caught flat-footed when COVID started to happen. They seemed to think that they could get this under control quickly. And I think at first everyone thought, well, this will be over in about 3 or 4 months. Perhaps because of how well China seemed to handle it and contain it within China, that we didn't realize how bad it was going to get as it moved around the world. But it was totally surprising that no one seemed prepared for it. And I was looking at material from the US, which every year or every 2 years have been training for a pandemic, yet none of the things that they had identified as actions that should be taken in the event of a pandemic were taken when COVID broke out. Quite surprisingly.
I think that's a really fascinating point, and you both touched on it, you know, earlier as well, that this concept of, you know, how do you identify the local relevance for things that, you know, you should see coming at you over the horizon. And I'm just interested in exploring that a little bit further. I mean, why don't businesses, you know, what are the challenges that stop us from, you know, seeing that, okay, Bali's been on the table for 6 years, it's coming, you know, what are we going to do about it and how are we going to do it? We know a pandemic is coming. We see, you know, ultimately how Hong Kong is playing out. Like, why do we keep getting surprised that these things are going to impact businesses large and small, you know, around the world, do you think?
I think one of the reasons for complacency, particularly in a market like Australia, is that we tend to look to the government to take care of a lot of these things for us. So Bali was seen as something that was occurring because of the bilateral relationship. The government's there, the government's going to try to solve it. Maybe we as businesses don't have to do that much. We'll wait and see what plays out. Surprisingly, the government couldn't solve it. And recently we've had the new trade minister, Dan Tehan, saying business is going to have to step up and do a lot more to try to repair some of the damage that's been done in the relationship with China. Now, I'm not sure to what extent business can, when a lot of that is to do with the dynamics of the government-to-government relationship. But there are things business could be doing. So, for example, when I was in China, I did a lot of work with US, basically farm export industry associations, who were constantly being hammered by things that were happening in the China-US relationship. And they needed to find a way to break that nexus and find a way through it so that they could deal directly with their customers in China and get their support. So I helped them to establish relationships with key stakeholders who would lobby the Chinese government that, you know, we need this particular farm product from America because it's the best in the world, it's the cheapest, it's the most reliable supply, whatever it was. We were able to do that because those industry associations saw the need for it. I think there's a lack of that approach in Australia, where people say, well, we as business should also be stepping up and trying to solve some of these problems for ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I mean, you know, is it, I mean, before I go on, I mean, Vanessa, you've just come back from Hong Kong, where extraordinary change over the last 2 years. And obviously, a lot of that driven by, the politics of the situation. But where do corporates even begin to think about how they communicate, even with their own staff, when, there's so little control that they would have over the decisions being made and how it's playing out in the street?
Yeah, I mean, it threw up massive complexities, a shift like that. And I suppose going back to, to Alistair's point too, around being prepared, and, a lot of businesses, international, local in Hong Kong, were also caught totally off guard by the political swings and shifts that happened in that market, even though the risk of that is literally ever present, because they are China. They're now owned by, back in the in the remit of China, but still it still caught everyone totally off guard, the pace and the veracity with which it happened. And I think it was really complex the way it played out, and the way businesses were sort of forced into a corner. Businesses that were once apolitical, or not needing to sort of be very vocal around their political standings, were now sort of forced into a corner, which was often very out of sync with what their staff and employee base felt like. So us as sort of corporate affairs professionals trying to advise, executives and businesses on positions to take and where we go here, it was really complex. I think, with one example is when I was working for a large retailer when the 2019 protests sort of kicked off, and I knew that part of the protests were part of my colleagues out there. But we also, as a business, had to sort of take a stand for safety, and had to take a stand for, peacefulness, and trying to bring that back into the space. So, but again, we had to go back to sort of scenario planning and risk management, and really looking forward on it all, and sort of trying to sort of take what has happened now. How can we sort of plan this now, and that went down all through the organization.
And I'm interested, picking on that point, for both, Alistair and Vanessa, like when you're confronting these situations, do you see that it is drawing on our core skill sets, whether it's corporate relations or risk management or government, affairs? Does it come down to us doing what we always do, but applying that in a slightly different way? Or do you see that these situations, whether it's navigating like a bilateral relationship or, a changing political environment, does it need something new and different from, corporate affairs professionals and corporate affairs functions, in your view?
Very good question. I think dealing with a lot of these things is really a team effort. I think there's a role for corporate affairs people in it, which comes to the messaging, etc., that may go around an issue or how you see something developing. But I think the other thing that corporate affairs people can often bring to the table is if they've had wide experience of dealing with different types of issues like this, be it in other markets or even in Australia, where they've seen how it was approached in the past, and they can bring that experience to the table. But again, I think it is always a team effort. I try to do a lot of work with people who work in risk analysis and geopolitical risk. I do a lot of work with lawyers, for example, and I think there's a role for all of them around the table. I think we play a role in terms of communications, but I think it's also a bigger role and can be much bigger based on the experience we have and based on what we do to improve our own knowledge and skill set, that we can bring more things to the table than just writing the press release or the speech for someone.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think you know, if you have sort of transaction experience, if you've worked on deals and you're used to sort of being around the table with legal and compliance and risk, taking those skills and applying them to sort of, you know, issues and crises of a geopolitical nature, even though that might not be your expertise. But there are other people with that expertise, but you have also worked through, you know, sort of complex issues where you've had to break down things and come up with a plan to go forward. You know, I certainly think that. I think there's definitely, you know, a need for sort of corporate affairs to always be at the table, you know, both during the crisis, even more so before, planning, business planning, forward planning, you know, looking on the horizon. Hopefully we could avert the crisis if possible. But yeah, certainly think that, you know, the traditional sort of communications team, you know, I think has definitely evolved and needs to sort of keep evolving. But I would definitely agree with Alistair that it is a team effort. And that's why, you know, I would always make sure that I would have really strong relationships with legal or with, you know, compliance or with the CIO, you know, with anyone, because there's always formal channels, but you never know when you need the informal channels too. Even Jane in warehousing, or, you know, someone that you just never know on any sort of given scenario or issue where you might need to call on those, you know, those contacts or those expertise for a bit more insight.
Yeah.
And I would just add that one of the important roles that I think people in corporate affairs can play in a crisis type situation is to maybe lead or facilitate a brainstorming workshop where you've got a lot of people around the table and you're trying to get the ideas down on how to solve this. And sometimes the best ideas come from someone you didn't expect to have that idea, but having a good facilitator that can help draw that out of the people around the table, get the ideas out there, and then start to work through how do we execute this is really important. I think that's a role for corporate affairs people. I think the other thing is quite often we bring calm to the room. You know, everyone's on a war footing in a crisis situation. Everyone's worried and running around madly, and just getting them to sit down, calm down, and start to think through the issues, I think is an important role we can play.
Yeah. No, I think that's excellent. And you've both touched on, you know, something that I, you know, believe strongly in, which is the idea of the role of corporate affairs as an integrator and a creator of consensus and internal consensus within an organisation. And often that relies on, you know, something you both also talked to, which is that outside-in perspective and really helping an organisation to understand what's coming at them over the horizon. So when, you know, you look at the current external environment, you've got pandemics, you've got you know, you've got China, you've got the US, you've got changes in politics, you've got, you know, any number of, you know, you've got Australia about, you know, very close to being in an election year. You know, you've got all of this, you know, stuff, and we've touched on, you know, any number of those can have any number of impacts on you and your local business. You know, how, you know, in that kind of environment, you know, how does corporate affairs even, you know, begin to think about understanding that long-term view on this is actually that kind of early warning system around these are the issues that are actually emerging, and potentially where there's still an opportunity to you know, so directly lobby the Chinese government to get those tariffs changed, or, you know, work with the US administration on, you know. So I mean, what's your view on, you know, what seems to work in your experience, and what kind of organizations do it well in having those kind of early warning systems around those risks and opportunities from that big global environment?
I might let Vanessa go first this time.
Yeah, it's quite a complex one. I think you know, it's really vital on the, you know, on the planning and the scenario planning, and, you know, that can get complex, but also, you know, with the scenario planning, having an action plan to move forward. So I mean, I'll try to give you just an example, I suppose, to create a bit of context so it's not so theoretical. But when the protests kicked off in Hong Kong, we were, you know, sort of, we were working on on a business critical redundancy change project as well, with a very highly regarded management consultancy that had been brought in. And they, as management consultants do, had very specific targets and projects and timelines and rollout. And this was, you know, a very well thought out thing. It was business critical. It needed to happen. But what they didn't bring was a sensitivity on the external environment, what was going on at that time. So, you know, we sort of got in the room and we said, well, we understand you need to do all this, but if you do all this while Hong Kong is literally burning in terms of protests and, you know, the volatility amongst our staff, and social media was going absolutely berserk, and we were sort of trying to sort of control messages all over the place. If we throw this huge spanner in the work that has the potential to sort of reputationally really damage the company, it shouldn't, but the way it would have been perceived would, you know, it could be catastrophic, and it could actually create a lot more reputational damage. You know, and also there's obviously the human element of doing a project like this. So, you know, corporate affairs really had to battle with management consultants, you know, who were just very keen to sort of put this timeline out. But for us, it was really bringing that outside perspective in and going, this is the geopolitical environment. You could totally destabilize this, and then the political roll-on of, you know, the political sort of fallout from that could actually be quite great. You know, and when it got back up to the CEO, you know, it's a big risk for us putting that advice out there too, because the CEO wants this project done and needs it done. When it got back to him, he sort of, thankfully, sort of very much got our point of view, and had to sort of, you know, realign everything to say, you know, we can't do this now. We have to really understand the risks of what's going on, and you know, and really take another look at it and realign, you know, the timeline and how we're going to roll this out.
Yeah, totally agree with everything Vanessa said. And I think that is, again, one of the important roles that corporate affairs people can play is sensitivity to what else is happening within the organization, with your external stakeholders. How do you deal with that? But going back to your question, I was going to say, you know, I started out by saying the big end of town seemed to know how to approach geopolitical risk. And if you think about it, and a company like your own one, Ilse, Shell, does a lot of work in this area, and it's constantly on a rolling basis where you're updating the risks, you're prioritizing them, you know, which ones might occur, have the highest risk of actually occurring, what's the impact they may have on the organization. And then based on that prioritization, working through how you would deal with them as they may actually occur, so that when they start to happen, you've got something there you can go to. It's a boilerplate. Maybe it's happening in a slightly different way to the way you had foreseen when you first did the exercise, and you start to then tweak it to deal with it, but you've got the plans there to do that. And that's the process I go through with a lot of my clients. And I've been doing this in the last few years with companies that do export to China, who've been looking at what are their risk, what's their risk profile in the China market based on their industry and the company and the reputational risk in particular.
And, you know, and sometimes, you know, the big end of town, you know, has the luxury of, you know, lots of different teams in lots of different markets. And so getting that advice around what is happening on the ground is easier than if you are, say, you know, university or a state government department, or, you know, someone who does just have an office in Brisbane. If you don't, and especially with the challenges around international travel, I mean, is it a realistic prospect for corporate affairs to really, you know, how do we get those market insights if we don't have a presence on the ground in, you know, whichever market around the world these risks might eventuate or might originate from? Do you think is there ways that we can do that?
Yes, there are. There are a lot of companies out there that provide business intelligence services who do analysis in particular sectors, particular countries. and being able to work with them. For example, there's a company called China Policy that I know quite well. They provide sector-specific intelligence on what's happening in the China market, how policies are changing, how regulations are changing, etc. So getting getting their information, I think, is vital. If you're selling wheat to China, for example, to get their analysis of what's happening in the wheat market or the coal market or whatever. Then from that, moving on to then doing your scenario planning, because you start to get a picture of how things may be developing. So I think there are ways you can outsource that. You don't have to do it all in-house. Mm-hmm. And occasionally, while you may be getting the information in-house, you may still want to outsource it just to have another perspective on what's happening in the market.
Mm. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I was going to mention, similar, there are companies like Control Risks and even the big global consultancies now, they do publish a lot of research that's accessible and free. At forums like this, to join particularly sector-specific or market-specific industry, where I think it's, we're very lucky that with the sort of proliferation of news sharing and social media that we do have access to, to some really good insights. I mean, you do have to distill it down still. There's a lot out there, and it's not all always relevant or good, but I think once you sort of can distill that down, I think it certainly for sort of smaller teams, I think that can be really useful.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And maybe to kind of, start to drill a little bit into, how you're seeing these big trends and what your own predictions are in terms of, what's coming up. I mean, we've touched a little bit on China, but I mean, we've got a new administration in the US, very different, agenda, particularly around, climate and climate risk. And a lot of, their engagement with other governments seem to be very issues based. They engage with them around climate or around the pandemic as opposed to kind of diplomacy for diplomacy's sake. I mean, what's your view on, how Australian businesses should be thinking about, how that is likely to play out? And, do you think that there are risks of, carbon tariffs and things like that are likely to be a factor that we're going to have to deal with maybe sooner rather than later? I mean, Alistair, do you want to maybe start with your views there?
Sure. I think it's something that companies definitely need to be preparing for, thinking about. For example, if you think about the Australia-EU free trade agreement that's been under negotiation for the last I'm not sure, 4 or 5 years, I think, and which is continuing. One of the issues that has come up in that is whether there should be some sort of penalties applied under the free trade agreement if Australia does not meet certain targets. I think it was the French government raised that issue, that if Australia failed to reach climate change targets, that they could impose some sort of penalty on Australian exports to the EU. The president of the EU has said that she would like to see a carbon border tax put in place for countries which are not complying with carbon reductions. So, this is something that's coming. No one should be surprised by it if it does suddenly hit the table. And I think when it first came up a couple of years ago, Simon Birmingham, as trade minister, said, well, that would be unprecedented. We shouldn't have it. Well, there are plenty of things around that are unprecedented until they are precedented. So it could well happen. We should be thinking about it, and companies need to start thinking around that, especially if Australia is not likely to meet those targets.
Okay, interesting. Vanessa, I don't know if you have any thoughts to add.
I'm not going to make predictions about, about climate. It's certainly not an area I'm very well versed in. But, what I will say is, like, there's on issues like climate, which is very, pertinent on the global stage, we're going to see pressure from different stakeholder groups as companies in Australia, whether it be investor groups, your consumer groups, or even your employee base are going to start sort of really becoming vocal about this stuff. I mean, there's a risk that Australia you know, could fall out of certain institutional investor mandates too, if you know, if we're not meeting their targets on, you know, whether they align with political targets as well, you know, on climate and other sustainability measures as well. So I think that's something that, you know, hopefully companies are thinking about or should be planning for. What I really saw in Hong Kong working for a large retailer was also the growing influence of NGOs to really sort of flex on these sort of issues. And, you know, whether properly informed or not, they can certainly make a lot of noise, you know, and also garner a lot of support. So really sort of, again, sort of back to what Alistair was saying, it's that risk planning, that risk radar, and understanding, you know, there is, you know, certain political or targets to meet on climate, but, you know, whether companies do or, you know, or don't fall into that soon, you know, that there may be other pressures sooner from other stakeholder groups as well.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think consumer and shareholder activism is on the rise and is going to force companies to take action on a number of things. We've already seen banks withdrawing from investing in greenfield coal mines, for example, because of consumer and shareholder activism. We're seeing mining companies saying they're getting out of coal mining, for example, again, because of that. We've recently seen companies like H&M and Nike saying that they're not going to be buying cotton from Xinjiang because of concerns of who's picking that cotton. You know, is it Uyghurs who are in internment camps in China? So, you know, that sort of thing is going to continue to rise. I think social media increases the intensity of it, and you're going to see more companies being responding to what their consumers and what their shareholders expect of them. And that's going to completely change the dynamic of geopolitics for them, because it's now not just about what's happening at a government-to-government level, it's also about what your own consumers and shareholders expect of you.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting. I might just pause there to see if there's any questions, if anyone wants to come off mute, or I see a few coming through chat. So first I might just see if anyone wants to come off mute and ask a question directly of the panel.
Hi guys, it's Amelia here. I did have a quick question. You mentioned, Alistair, early on that Australians really look at the government to solve issues when this stuff comes up, and you've just mentioned, you know, that there is a trend emerging that there's more pressure on businesses and CEOs to go through. My question is, you know, Australians definitely look at the government to solve with the other key countries and players. Do they also follow suit, or, you know, are they actually being led by business already, or do they still kind of rely back on the government to solve these issues?
And sorry, I just need to clarify the question. You're asking whether companies in those other markets are pushing forward with
yeah, so I guess
issues?
I'm just interested. So Australians, you know, are still relying back on the government to solve these issues. Do you see that same pattern in the China or the US, or is it actually that, you know, the population's actually pushing more on businesses to take the lead?
Yeah, well, certainly in the US, and I have a lot of experience dealing with US industry organizations, and they did tend to see that the private sector needed to become more involved. And I always thought this was a cultural thing because of the way America developed, you know, that frontier spirit and the expansion west and the way Americans think, and it's very individualistic, etc. And they don't tend to rely that heavily on government. I did see with some European companies that I was dealing with when I was in China that there was we need to take this up ourselves and look at how we can try to fix the problem. So I worked with a number of European companies on intellectual property type issues, and they were looking at how do they work through the Chinese court system without necessarily engaging their own embassies in the particular issue until it really became necessary to do it. They wanted to demonstrate that they were committed to being in China and this was their issue, and they weren't trying to make a diplomatic issue out of it. So there was a tendency for that to happen. In the context of China, I think there are a few dynamics that tend to play out in China. One is that it is very much a communist country, has been, apart from the last 40 years where private sector companies have started to rise, but they still look to the government to help solve things, at least at the international level. But one of the interesting things that does play out in China is that private companies can go and talk to the government and say, well, this isn't really helping us. Can you change this policy? Can you relook at it? In a Chinese cultural context, lobbying doesn't exist in China the way it does in Australia, but lobbying does exist in China. So it may not be as forthright, you may not read about it in the media, but there are conversations that do take place. And given that a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs have now been given seats in the National People's Congress or the Political Consultative Council, they do have a voice in it and do have the ear of government. So that does start to happen a lot more in a market like China. And not Vanessa, sure if I've answered the question. I hope I have.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vanessa, what's your observation in like Southeast Asia and Hong Kong, and in terms of the tendency or the ability of businesses to engage directly with governments on constructive dialogue around this stuff?
Oh, look, I don't think I can adequately give a view on that. None of the projects I worked on. I mean, sorry, just to backtrack, I suppose, it's sort of like what Alice has said. It's a lot more under the radar. Say in a country like Indonesia, it's there's not as obvious lobbying. A lot of it does come under the guise of the government, but I do think that there's the less sort of less obvious lobbying going on, but yeah.
No, absolutely. And a question from Rachel in chat. I mean, what's your view of, as we look into 2022, Alistair and Vanessa, question for both of you, I guess, is, what do you see as a big geopolitical risk for Australian businesses? Is it going to be more of the same, or are there things, new and emerging things that we should be, thinking about?
Okay, I'm going to start by quoting the Nobel Physicist Prize winner, Niels Bohr, who once said, never make predictions, especially about the future. But what I would say is, I think we probably live in, to Chinese curse, interesting times, unpredictable times, if you like. The dynamic of geopolitics has been changing. If you think back to when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell, an academic by the name of Francis Fukuyama had said that this is the end of history, that we won't see big ideological battles taking place in the future. And no worse prediction has ever been made, because that's exactly what we're seeing today. And it's this battle between democracy and more authoritarian states, where if you look at Turkey, if you look at China, if you look at Russia, if you look at Brazil, you're seeing a drift towards more authoritarian rule. Even the US, until the recent election, was looking more like that. And so there is a battle that is going on at an ideological level that is driving a lot of what is happening in terms of geopolitics. The other thing I would suggest anyone who's interested in this topic, a really good book to read, which came out in, I think, 2009, is by a geopolitical strategist and futurist named George Friedman. And he wrote a book called The Next 100 Years. And when I read that in 2009, I thought a lot of this was fanciful stuff. Looking back on it from 2021, it's quite amazing how much of what he was forecasting has started to play out. And he talks about the tectonic shifts in geopolitics that are taking place, how important China is going to become. Back then he was saying that ISIS and Islamic extremism was a flash in the pan that wouldn't continue. And it does look as though that's quietening down. And here we've seen some bigger shifts. And he says China, Russia, and Turkey are going to be the big players in the 21st century. And we need to be aware of that and what that's likely to mean. So without making any predictions, get a copy of that book and have a read of it.
Very good. I might pause there again to see if there's any other questions and if anyone else wants to come off mute and ask them.
I have a question. It's Erica here. I would love to know what it's like. Maybe, Vanessa, this would be a question more for you, but following all of the protests and everything that were happening in Hong Kong, what was it like? Like, what's it like there now? Has it changed how business operates? Are they able to plan into the future? Like, what's the current state in Hong Kong? I know you've been out of there for a few months now, but what are you hearing?
Look, I think it's still very much uncertain. You know, like I was saying before, the change in Hong Kong in sort of 18 months was, you know, almost unbelievable. And I think that the fabric there at the moment with this new national security law has made the operating environment just so unpredictable. Now, at the same time, business can't stand still from that. And you've got such a myriad of businesses in Hong Kong too. You've got, you know, locally listed firms, you've got international banks, you've got hedge funds, you've got private equity, you've got, you know, small businesses, you've got, you know, China SOEs as well. So, you know, the degrees of what different businesses can do. I mean, some international banks I know are looking at, I'm not going to predict, but they are looking at different jurisdictions. They are looking at moving teams. You're seeing teams move. You're seeing sort of them exploring different licensing, you know, options in other parts of Asia. So, you know, some companies can still operate within Hong Kong, but shift the sort of, you know, their higher risk areas out of there. Whereas, you know, the sort of the more committed local companies, you know, that they can't do that. But there's certainly, you know, from my conversations recently with people there, there's certainly a lot more, you know, from a corporate affairs perspective, everyone is skilling up on government affairs. Everyone is skilling up on China public affairs. You know, companies that wouldn't have even thought that way are now having to think that way. You know, so there's a real caution in the market, I think. There's, you know, everything, it feels, I mean, Hong Kong will always be dynamic, but it feels like it's, you know, there's a bit of a blanket that's come over it and settling over it. And I think the murkiness of the national security law and, you know, just it's, you know, providing a lot of uncertainty just in terms of freedom of press and democracy and the rule of law. So, you know, I think businesses, ever more importantly, you know, it's ever more important to be planning and looking at different scenarios. And some of those scenarios might have seemed so extreme, and to what Alistair was saying before. But, you know, I would never have thought that Hong Kong would have gone from a sort of relatively open and democratic sort of society to sort of muted under a national security law within 18 months. You know, I don't think anyone sort of actually predicted that, though. Maybe.
Do you see them maintaining that status, it's Erica again, sorry, that status of that kind of global super powerhouse?
That's a tough one. I think China needs Hong Kong. You know, it's access to capital. It's sort of international. You know, it's always sort of, you know, being at, you know, the IPO market there, the listing market there. I think, you know, but China needs a bit more control over it. Is what it's doing at the moment. So I think Hong Kong will always have that international flair and international sort of standing. I don't think that's going to change quickly, but I think, you know, I certainly think it's not like it used to be. It's not like sort of the way you'd sort of seamlessly move between London, New York, Hong Kong, you know, in that way. I guess another example is, you know, one of my friends is a very senior sort of headhunter in Hong Kong, and you know, the pipeline of candidates looking to go into that market now, you know, is dramatically different from 2 years ago. So I think that speaks volumes of, you know, when you're looking at talent and movement and the willingness of people to be able to attract talent to a centre, you know, still there, definitely, but definitely has changed.
I think it was a really interesting point you made, Vanessa, around how, you know, the teams are changing, they're upskilling in Chinese public policy. I mean, the thing that I remember about Hong Kong was, you know, what a intense media market was. I think that it had one of the highest per capita number of media publications and consumption in the world, and that was always such a core part of your team. And it's quite fascinating to think that that might play a very different role in the future compared to someone who can help you understand what Beijing may or may not do as well.
Definitely. You look at, you know, like you said, you used to be able to hold a press conference in Hong Kong and know that 50 different media outlets will turn up. And, you know, I don't think that changes, but I think that, you know, that there's definitely been some foreign media licenses, visas revoked. I think they're going to scrutinise that harder going forward. And even on the local landscape, I mean, they've just jailed Jimmy Lai, you know, the chairman of Apple Daily, which was one of the most outspoken publications against the mainland and Hong Kong and now Hong Kong government. So, you know, you're seeing this sort of silencing going around here, and I think, you know, there's a real sensitivity from a corporate affairs perspective too around what you want to say publicly and what you can advise on saying publicly as well, because with the guise of this new law, there's a real risk that it can be interpreted in a number of different ways.
And I think that's an interesting point that I'd like to pick up on with a question for both you and Alistair. You know, when, you know, you're as a corporate and you're advising your corporate on, you know, your corporation on what to say publicly, and we've seen a little bit of this, say, in Australia with, you know, Qantas and, you know, Alan Joyce and some of the argy-bargy between him and ScoMo around, do you stand up for marriage equality or you don't? You know, when you're facing these, you know, big issues, national security, you know, the relationship with China, the relationship with the US, climate, do corporations need to pick sides? Like, is that where we're at?
Good question. My advice was always, when I lived and worked in China, was always to avoid picking sides and getting dragged into those bigger political debates where you could. So, you know, I would always tell them, you know, don't talk about the 3 Ts, Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen. They were definitely a no-go in China. I had clients who, because they'd produce a map of mainland of China on their website, but they'd leave Taiwan off, would find themselves in trouble with the authorities. So I'd always be advising them, you know, be sensitive to the local issues, local concerns of the government and the people. And you know, this is something that's not just a government issue in China. If Taiwan is part of China, the local people want to see Taiwan included as part of your China strategy. It's not a separate market, a separate country. So those things are important. I think now there is more pressure both from Washington and from Beijing that you have to pick a side. And, you know, it's going to be interesting to see how corporations like HSBC, for example, deal with that, where they're being pushed very hard by both sides to choose. And you've got to choose. And part of the problem is that this isn't the days of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where there wasn't a lot of trade and engagement. A lot of companies, global players, multinationals, are heavily invested in China and heavily invested in the US. How do you choose a side given that? And how do you walk that fine line? And, you know, I think for each company and each industry, they're going to have to look at that very carefully. I think, you know, the current line in the US, and which is I think rather unfortunately getting a little bit of traction amongst politicians in Australia is the need to decouple from China. Well, what does decoupling mean? If we come back to Australia, well, we decouple from China. Well, that's taking 40% of our exports right now. And you can talk all you want about diversification. That's not going to happen in 1 or 2 years' time. That's a long-term strategy. If we wanted to diversify, we should have been talking about that 10 years ago. I think companies are going to find it very challenging to walk that line as the conflict between Washington and Beijing intensifies.
And do you think, what's your prediction with Washington and China? Because it is obviously something that has very real implications for anyone who does business in Australia. There was a very testy exchange, recently. Is it cyclical? Is this a new paradigm? I mean, from what you're both seeing and the various factors at play, because I think, Japan and Washington and the Quad and all of this, I think will be interesting to see how it plays out. But is it going to get worse before it gets better, or have we hit rock bottom?
Well, I'm not sure if we've hit rock bottom. I think it's going to get a little bit worse before it starts to get better. About 10 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about whether we were in a Thucydides trap. It's this idea that as one empire is rising and another one is waning, they inevitably will have conflict. And 10 years ago, the discussion was, no, it doesn't have to be that way. But if you look at it right now, you'd say, well, yes, that's exactly what's happening. We've got we've got two superpowers on their way to a collision course. They're at loggerheads with each other on a whole range of issues. To what extent is it that the trap actually does exist, or that it's become self-fulfilling, or that it's being pushed by one side or the other, or both sides along that line? But part of it is China. If you talk to Chinese, if you live in China, you get this sense that they do feel that they had 100 years of humiliation by the West, from the Opium Wars through to the eight-power invasion of China and the sacking of the Summer Palace. They really feel that very deeply, and we need to be cognizant of it and understanding of it, that this is something that's very deep inside them. So that thing we saw play out in Alaska just a few weeks ago was a little bit of Chinese theatrics, but to let the West know enough is enough. We will be treated as equal partners. Hopefully now under Biden, there's going to be a little bit more respect shown to China in how we deal with them. And the good thing about Biden, and I think this is where Biden and Trump differed. Trump was very much about, he was going to do it his way. He's the strong man. He was going to strong man people into accepting what he wanted. Biden is much more about building alliances and working with those allies. And I think that plays better for Australia, because I think we fell into a trap with Trump of needing to go out there and, the way the Chinese viewed it is we'd become the deputy sheriff of the US in the region. And I don't think that was doing us any good. I've always said we didn't need to lead the charge on banning Huawei from Australia's 5G network. We could have waited for other countries to take the lead on that and say, oh yeah, and by the way, we're going to ban Huawei as well for whatever reasons, rather than going it alone. Or the call for an inquiry into the outbreak of COVID. Yeah. Did we really need to be the first country to come out and call for that? And you'd have seen the comments in the last couple of days by New Zealand's foreign minister saying that, she was concerned about the way the Five Eyes is being used now as a platform to whack China over the head rather than a intelligence sharing organization. That's why New Zealand didn't sign up to the Five Eyes' recent criticism of the WHO's investigation of COVID. And, I'd hope that Australia can take a step back and start to say, well, yes, we need to take a more, a broader view of these things, look at how we build some alliances so we're not out there on our own or seen as the deputy sheriff of the US, which I think the Five Eyes and the way it's being used at the moment is putting us at risk of becoming.
No, it's a really interesting point, Alistair, around, partnerships and alliances. And I think it's, something when you think about within, businesses and how you navigate this, I think it's, really important, and as it very much, within the purview of corporate affairs to help, companies really build those partnerships and those alliances externally. Conscious of time, so, where I kind of wanted to, end up, but this is actually a nice segue, Alistair, to what you've been talking about. If you were, leading a corporate affairs function for a business here in Brisbane or a business here in Australia, and all, being impacted to a greater or lesser extent to geopolitical risks, what's the one thing that you'd really want your CEO to understand? And when you're thinking about, your priorities for your function, what would be top of your list heading into, the rest of 2021 and beyond? Alistair, we might kick off with you and then Vanessa, hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, if we're looking at 2021, I'd say right now the biggest risk for any company in Australia, major corporation, is probably the Australia-China relationship and how that's playing out. So I'd be saying to that CEO, we need to do a few things around that. Firstly, we need to look at some scenarios. How could this play out? How could it impact our business? We need to then do some planning on what we can do about that. How do we mitigate that? And while some of the answer might be in diversifying our markets, that's not going to happen overnight. So how do we then leverage our relationships in China to try to make sure we're not impacted if things continue to go south? And then I'd say we need to look at how we also engage with the Australian government and get across our concerns to them about the way things are going and how we think things could be done much better. And, maybe we could learn something from New Zealand or from the EU or a number of the EU countries who are managing difficult things in their relationship with China, but they haven't gone as badly as they have for us, or, Southeast Asian nations or Japan or South Korea.
Yeah, absolutely. Vanessa, any thoughts from you?
I would have to echo, Alistair there. I think, the fractiousness of the China relationship and the effect that it has on, on Australian business. I think, it's very easy to sort of think that we can just decouple from that. But, the reality is we have to be totally eyes wide open and really thinking critically and strategically about that and the flow on implications about that. So, so really, being in the room with the executives and really understanding sort of right down the business where, where that lands, is really critical. I think also, COVID, the vaccination rollout and the sort of tension amongst sort of countries worldwide, will also be something to keep an eye on. Particularly as borders open up and there's a lot of finger pointing and there's a lot of, different sort of taunts going on. And I think that's, something we need to be really sensitive and cognizant of, as well as, as global citizens as well. And hopefully we can sort of keep that, that sort of feeling of global citizens, and not become too sort of nationalistic and statism in the way that we're sort of dealing with and thinking, because I think Australia is such a sort of advanced market in the Asia Pacific region, and it's got such a strong role to play there. And and hopefully we can calm everything down and move forward positively.
Fantastic. I'm conscious we're at time. Alistair and Vanessa, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating conversation, and I certainly have come away with a lot of things to think about. And I think your points around how do you be proactive and constructive and create a space for your organisation to mitigate those risks and manage those opportunities in a really proactive way, as opposed to just waiting for these tsunami waves to kind of of hit your organisation, I think is definitely food for thought. So thank you very much, and again a huge thank you to Erica and you for all your support. Thanks everyone for your time. I hope that you found the discussion as interesting as I did. We'll circulate a recording as always, and we'll be sending out some information on our next event, which will be around Comtech and how to use data and technology within corporate affairs. So looking forward to that one. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Right.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.